There's a silence that no one prepares you for. A silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from the absence of identity. It arrives after the breakthrough, after the blissful high of seeing through the illusion, after the masks fall and the old life dissolves. In the beginning, spiritual awakening feels like being reborn in light. You feel limitless. You cry from a joy that has no name. The heart bursts open. The universe no longer seems like something outside of you, it pulses within you. You think this is it. You've found it. You've arrived. But you haven't. That was just the threshold, the invitation. What follows next isn't often spoken of in the stories that glamorize enlightenment. What comes next is not transcendence, but descent. And that descent is where most people feel lost, confused, hollow. Not because they've failed, but because the very self they used to identify with is gone and nothing yet has taken its place. That's the emptiness. That's the unspoken truth. Awakening doesn't fill you. It empties you. It scrapes away the false layers so completely that for a time you walk around like a ghost in your own body, unable to recognize who you were, uncertain of who you are, and terrified to admit you don't know who you're becoming. This is the liminal space between death and rebirth. And it's here, right here, where most people abandon the path. Not because they lack courage, but because no one told them this would happen. No one explained that after the light floods in there is a great quieting, a disorienting stillness. Carl Jung called this confrontation with the self. Not the ego self, the roles we play and names we answer to, but the archetypal self, the totality of what we are, including everything we've denied, repressed, rejected. And to stand before the self is to stand naked, stripped of narratives, achievements, spiritual posturing. The illusions of separation fall apart. You begin to see the face. You show the world is not your true face, and worse, you don't yet know what your true face looks like. You look into the mirror and see the outline of a person with no story left to tell. That is the collapse of identity, of belief systems, of all the frameworks you once used to keep yourself feeling safe and spiritual. This collapse is not the end of awakening. It is the beginning of the real journey. The journey inward, the journey downward, the spiral descent into the unconscious. And the unconscious does not greet you with clarity. It greets you with dreams, symbols, and shadows. Things you don't understand. Things you thought you had outgrown. You start to feel things you can't name. You begin to encounter moods that aren't yours, images that appear in meditation, uninvited memories, long buried, suddenly rising with unbearable intensity. You realize healing wasn't a straight line, it's a spiral. And you're back again at wounds you thought were already healed, only now they speak in a different language. They don't ask to be analyzed, they ask to be felt. This is why the emptiness feels so consuming. You're not just losing your old self, you're being initiated into the depth of your soul. But the soul does not emerge in clarity, it emerges in grief, in longing, in loss. You mourn relationships that no longer resonate. You question values you once held sacred. You begin to sense that you cannot go back, but you're also unsure how to go forward. You're caught in the in-between where you are no longer who you were, and not yet who you're becoming. And in this space, the only voice you hear is the silence of your own becoming. The silence begins to stretch. Days feel slower. You're less reactive to the world, but also less engaged. You begin to detach, not from a place of wisdom, but because your system is recalibrating. Your nervous system is learning how to exist without the constant rush of stimulation. You're detoxing not just from media and people, but from identities, from egoic roles that once made you feel important, wanted, useful. You stop wanting to explain yourself. You grow tired of trying to be understood. You begin to feel invisible in a world that only validates what it can label. But invisibility is part of the process. It's not punishment, it's purification. You're being emptied so that something new can be born through you, and that birth will not be easy. Because what is emerging isn't a better version of you, it's the true you, and truth doesn't come wearing jewelry and white robes. Truth is raw, wild, shadowed, beautiful in ways the world isn't ready for. That's why so few people complete the process of awakening. Because they thought they'd be exalted. Instead, they were excavated. They thought awakening would give them answers. Instead, it took everything they thought they knew and left them alone with only the sound of their own breath and a mirror that reflects nothing but depth. You walk through this mirror, and what you find is not paradise, but paradox. The paradox that you are everything and nothing, that you are divine and deeply human, that you are infinite but bound by this body, that you can feel lightness in one breath and suffocating dread in the next, and that all of it is holy. The joy, the grief, the rage, the numbness. Nothing is rejected anymore, not even rejection itself. And here in this space of radical inclusion, you begin to understand why the emptiness is sacred. It's not absence, it's presence in its most subtle, unadorned form. The presence of self. Not the self that performs, but the self that is. And you for the first time start to see your life as myth. Not as failure, not as accident, but as initiation. Every loss was a door. Every silence was a sign. Every collapse was a call to something deeper. And now the call is clear. Go inward. Not to find more answers, but to lose the need for them. Not to become something more, but to unbecome everything you're not. You begin to understand that unbecoming is not a failure, it's freedom. The more layers fall away, the more silence begins to settle, not as punishment, but as invitation. The silence becomes a language, a holy presence that doesn't shout, but waits. Not for you to master something, but for you to surrender everything. And what you're surrendering is not just the ego's grandiosity, but its hidden fears. The need to be seen, to be validated, to be needed. You start to see how even your most spiritual tendencies were built on insecurity. The desire to save others, to be the wise one, the peaceful one, the enlightened one. All of it performance. And when those identities dissolve, what remains is a terrifying simplicity. You, without adjectives, without titles, without explanation. Just the raw pulsating awareness of your own being. It feels empty, but only because you were so full of noise for so long that you forgot what real presence feels like. And now as you sit with this quiet, this strange weightlessness, you realize something profound. For the first time in your life, you are not trying to be anything. You are simply here. And yet, being here isn't easy. The world doesn't understand stillness. It sees your inward turn as depression, your silence as avoidance, your solitude as sadness. People around you may grow distant. Some may even accuse you of changing. And they'd be right. You are changing, but not in the way they think. You're not becoming someone new, you're shedding everything that isn't you. And that shedding is messy. It's not a clean, linear process. Some days you'll feel free. Other days you'll feel crushed under the weight of your own awareness. You'll notice patterns in yourself that you can't unsee. The way you deflect intimacy. The way you hide behind busyness. The way you chase what wounds you just to feel alive. This is shadow work, not as a concept, but as lived reality. Carl Jung taught that we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And now, the darkness is no longer abstract. It's personal. You're meeting the parts of yourself you buried. The child who felt invisible. The teenager who learned to lie to survive. The adult who smiles while dying inside. These aren't just emotions, they're truths. And they demand to be honored, not fixed. But honoring them doesn't mean indulging them. It means witnessing them without flinching. It means sitting with your rage without letting it consume you. It means holding your grief without trying to numb it. It means letting the shame speak its story before you silence it with self-help slogans. In this space, healing becomes less about getting rid of pain and more about learning how to carry it with grace. You don't want to be a better version of yourself anymore. You want to be an honest one. You begin to see that growth is not about ascension, but descent. Into the body, into the breath, into the shadows you swore you'd never touch. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that the emptiness isn't punishment. It's the preparation ground for depth, for intimacy with your own soul, for a truth that doesn't scream, but whispers. And that whisper says, stop running. There's nowhere to go. Everything you've been seeking is already inside you, but it requires stillness to be felt. Not the stillness of meditation techniques, but the stillness of surrender, of letting go of the chase, the striving, the fixing. And so, you begin to live differently. Slower, quieter, more present. You no longer feel the need to fill every silence with words. You no longer chase the highs that used to distract you from yourself. You start to value discomfort because you know it's real. You welcome solitude because it feels safe. You stop reaching for people who don't know how to hold you, not out of bitterness but from wisdom. You know now that not everyone can meet you in this depth. Most people fear it. They fear the mirror you've become. Because when they look at you, they see their own unfinished work, their own shadows, their own longing for something more real. And so they distance, they criticize, they label you as too much or too intense. But you are not too much, you are simply no longer diluted. You've stopped editing yourself to fit into places that never felt like home. You've stopped begging for connection from those who only offer performance. You've stopped proving your worth because you finally feel it, not as a concept, but as a felt experience. Not because of what you do, but because of what you are conscious. Aware. Awake. Awake to the beauty and brutality of being human. Awake to the sacred ache of existence. Awake to the paradox that we are both wounded and whole, both divine and terrified, both radiant and raw. And in that awareness, something shifts. The emptiness begins to shimmer. It doesn't go away, but it changes flavor. It no longer feels like absence. It feels like spaciousness, like potential, like the infinite canvas upon which a truer life can be painted. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Built not on ideals or approval, but on authenticity. You start to create from your center. You speak when words feel true. You move when your body says yes. You let life shape you not into something impressive, but into something aligned. You no longer resist what is. You no longer perform what isn't. And in that integrity, you begin to taste a deeper kind of peace. Not the peace that avoids pain, but the peace that includes it. The peace that knows suffering is not the opposite of awakening, it is its doorway. The peace that comes when you stop trying to escape the human experience and start embracing it as sacred. And that's the real secret. The emptiness after awakening is not something to be feared. It is the ground of rebirth, the cocoon between what was and what will be. It is the dark womb of the psyche, where the soul begins to take shape again, not as an idea, but as embodiment, as presence, as breath. You begin to trust that nothing real can be lost, that every loss was only the shedding of a false self, that every silence was a call inward, that every collapse was a form of grace in disguise. You begin to walk with reverence, not because life is easy, but because it is holy. Every moment becomes a ritual. Every breath becomes a blessing. You are not chasing divinity anymore, you are living it. Even in your confusion, even in your mess, even in your emptiness, especially in your emptiness. Because that emptiness is not the absence of self, it is the reintroduction of soul. You begin to realize the soul doesn't scream. It never has. It has only ever whispered, beneath the noise of your goals, beneath the fear that made you achieve, beneath the smile that was hiding your ache, beneath every moment you played strong while quietly unraveling inside. The soul has always spoken softly through longing, through discomfort, through that subtle knowing that something wasn't right, even when everything looked perfect on the outside. And now that everything else has fallen away, you finally hear it clearly. That voice beneath all voices, it doesn't give you a new identity to wear. It doesn't promise certainty. It simply tells the truth: you are not broken. You're just no longer willing to live in illusions. And that unwillingness costs you everything you thought you needed to survive. It costs you popularity, performance, predictability, but in return, it gives you something more precious than all of that: realness, wholeness, presence. You stop living from outside in and begin to live from inside out. You stop measuring your worth by the applause and start measuring it by your alignment. You don't care if they understand you anymore. You care if you're being true, and being true is terrifying at first. Because truth doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like standing naked in the middle of your life and realizing most of what you've built was a performance. The job, the relationships, the persona, even the spirituality. It all came from the wounded place that thought, if I just become enough, I'll finally be loved. But awakening rips that root out. It forces you to see the real motivation behind your striving, not to shame you, but to free you. You begin to ask yourself deeper questions, not how do I succeed, but who am I without success, not how do I attract love, but am I living as love? Not what should I do, but what feels true to my soul in this moment, and these questions aren't answered by logic. They're answered by silence, by stillness, by the deep sacred no that rises when something is out of alignment, even if it looks perfect, by the unexpected yes that pulses in your belly when something raw and real calls you forward, even if it terrifies your mind. You begin to trust that voice. Not the voice of fear, not the voice of ego, but the voice that feels like home. That deep intuitive knowing that lives beneath your wounds. And trusting it doesn't mean you always feel safe. In fact, it often means walking away from safety, from comfort, from the familiar patterns and people that once gave you a false sense of control. It means saying goodbye to the life you thought you were supposed to live and saying yes to the life that is actually yours. It means disappointing others so you can stop betraying yourself. It means being misunderstood, misjudged, even ridiculed, because you refuse to shrink into someone you no longer are. And yes, it hurts. It hurts to let go. It hurts to be real in a world that worships image. But you hurt anyway. So why not hurt for something true? Why not hurt your way into freedom rather than numb your way into another performance? Carl Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And when you awaken, this truth pierces you. You start to see that most conversations are performances, that most people speak not to connect but to distract, that real intimacy is rare, not because people don't want it, but because they're terrified of what it might expose. But you're no longer terrified. You've touched something deeper. You've seen what's behind the curtain, and now you crave depth the way you once craved approval. You don't want to be liked, you want to be known. You don't want small talk, you want soul talk. You want connection that can hold your shadows, your silence, your becoming. And when you can't find that outside, you create it within. You become the safe space you've always longed for. You hold yourself in ways no one ever held you. You stop waiting to be chosen, and you choose yourself again and again, until your presence becomes the love you were always seeking. This is the sacred return. Not a return to who you were, but to who you've always been beneath the noise. The soul isn't something you find, it's what's revealed when everything false falls away. And when it begins to lead your life, doesn't become easier, it becomes real. You no longer chase high vibrations or manifest glossy dreams. You anchor into presence, into truth, into the breath. You don't try to escape the moment you deepen into it. You let it show you what you've been avoiding. You let it crack you open. And through that crack something new is born, not more knowledge, but more capacity. Capacity to feel, to hold, to witness, to stay. You become a vessel, not for perfection, but for presence. You stop asking life to give you answers and start asking life to keep you honest. You stop needing to know where it's all going and start trusting that the deeper you go into yourself, the clearer the next step will become. And slowly, your relationship with emptiness changes. You no longer see it as a void to be filled. You see it as a space to be honored, a sacred field where the divine breathes into you without words. You don't try to force clarity anymore. You wait, you listen, you trust, and in that trust you begin to remember what the world made you forget, that you are not here to perform. You are not here to be perfect. You are not here to fit into systems that feed on your insecurity. You are here to awaken, to burn through illusion, to become whole, to walk the path that only your soul knows, and that path begins exactly where you are, empty, silent, undone. That's the doorway. That's the miracle. That's the truth that everything you were avoiding in the emptiness was the very place where life was trying to meet you, hold you, heal you, not by fixing you, but by showing you that you were never broken. The mind still resists. Even after all this unraveling, even after the ego has lost its throne, it still whispers temptations in the dark. It still asks, what now? It still demands a purpose, a direction, a certainty. And there will be moments you're tempted to rush back to the surface, to grasp at another role, another relationship, another identity that tells you who you are. Because the silence still scares you sometimes, because this much openness feels like vulnerability, because even after awakening, the human part of you still longs to belong, still craves recognition, still aches to be held in ways the world rarely knows how to hold. But now you see the whisper for what it is, not truth but habit, not guidance but fear wearing the mask of urgency. And instead of obeying it, you pause. You return to the breath. You ground yourself in the moment. You remember that wholeness doesn't come from chasing, it comes from allowing. And in that, allowing, something powerful begins to root inside of you. A stillness that cannot be shaken, a clarity that doesn't need explanation, a knowing that doesn't need proof. This is what real power feels like, not dominance, not control, but presence. The ability to stay rooted in your center, even when the world spins around you. The ability to listen to your soul, even when your mind screams for answers. The ability to honor your truth, even when it costs you approval. This is the kind of power that doesn't make noise, but changes everything it touches. And it's born through emptiness, through the willingness to let life strip you of every false layer, until only the essential remains. You begin to see how much you've been carrying that was never yours. Expectations inherited from wounded parents. Stories passed down from cultures that fear freedom. Spiritual ideas that became prisons instead of portals. And now, one by one, you lay them down. Not with anger, but with reverence. Because you see they were part of the journey, but they cannot come with you where you're going. This path is too narrow for baggage. It requires you to walk with empty hands and an open heart. It requires you to surrender your need to understand and replace it with the courage to feel. And feeling is the sacred art you've been learning all along. Not feeling to react or analyze, but feeling to witness, to embrace, to alchemize. You begin to understand that every emotion is a messenger, every contraction a clue, every ache a doorway. You no longer shame your sadness. You don't bypass your anger. You hold space for your grief without rushing it. You start to see that feeling deeply isn't a weakness, it's a superpower. It means your armor is gone. It means your soul is alive. It means you're no longer numbing the very signals that are guiding you home. And in this space of radical honesty, your healing deepens, not because you're fixing yourself, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself. You no longer need others to validate your wounds. You validate them by staying with them. You validate them by letting them speak. You become the parent you never had, the lover you always longed for, the witness you always needed. And that changes everything. Because now you're not just surviving your pain, you're transmuting it, turning it into wisdom, into softness, into compassion that doesn't just extend outward but inward, too. You begin to see others differently, not as threats, not as saviors, but as mirrors. Each person becomes a reflection of a part of you, some familiar, some forgotten, some feared. And instead of reacting to them, you study the reflection. You ask, what is this showing me about myself? You stop blaming, you stop projecting, you start integrating. And this doesn't make life easier, it makes it real. Relationships shift, some fade, some deepen, but all become clearer. Because you no longer pretend, you no longer shrink, you no longer tolerate the kind of love that asks you to betray yourself. You want depth or nothing. You want truth, even if it's messy. You want connection that honors your becoming, not just your performance. And when you meet someone who sees you, without trying to fix you, who can sit in the silence with you, and not fill it with noise, you realize that you've come home. Not just to them, but to yourself. Because only when you've held your own darkness can you hold someone else's without fear. And this is the new way you begin to live, not from seeking, but from being. You don't chase love, you become it. You don't hunt for meaning, you embody it. You don't reach for power, you anchor into it. And in this shift, life becomes less about what you do and more about how you do it. You start to notice the sacred in the ordinary, the way the sun filters through your window, the way your breath softens when you stop trying, the way your body hums when you tell the truth. You become available to life not as something to conquer, but as something to feel, to touch, to dance with. And this availability is what transforms everything. It's what makes your presence magnetic. It's what turns your wounds into wisdom. It's what makes you a living permission slip for others to be real. Because you've gone where they're afraid to go. You've touched what they've been taught to avoid. And you've returned not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has stopped needing them. That's the mark of true awakening. Not the certainty, not the enlightenment, but the humility, the openness, the deep quiet reverence for the mystery. You stop performing because you realize presence is enough. You stop striving because you trust that what is meant for you will come. You stop fixing because you know nothing is broken. Even the emptiness, especially the emptiness. Because now you see it clearly. It was never empty. It was always full of the self, waiting to be remembered. Waiting for you to be still enough, honest enough, brave enough to return. Not to some idealized version of spirituality. Not to a perfectly curated persona. But to you. Raw, unfiltered. Alive. And that is the most spiritual thing you can be. And now, you stand at the edge. Not the edge of a cliff, but the edge of your former self. You look back and everything behind you seems like a dream within a dream. Distant, surreal, familiar, but unreachable. You feel the weight of everything you've let go, of roles that once defined you, relationships that once sustained you, stories that once protected you. And yet, despite the loss, you've never felt more whole. Because in losing everything that wasn't you, you found everything that is. Not in a sudden explosion of clarity, but in the slow, sacred unfolding of truth, through silence, through surrender, through the ache of unbecoming. You no longer look outside for confirmation. You no longer wait for permission. You no longer carry the burden of needing to be understood. You walk with quiet authority, not the kind that seeks attention, but the kind that doesn't need it. You've returned to yourself, and in doing so you've returned to the world not as an imposter wearing a mask, but as a soul finally visible in its full spectrum, broken and beautiful, shadowed and sovereign, empty and complete. This is the paradox. You now live with grace. You're no longer searching, and yet everything you do is a discovery. Every breath reveals something new. Every step uncovers another layer. You're not trying to be conscious. You are consciousness. And from that space, you no longer move through life as a seeker, but as an embodiment. You've become what you were chasing. Not because you figured it all out, but because you stopped trying to. The need to arrive has dissolved. The obsession with being healed has faded. You now understand that healing isn't a destination, it's a rhythm, a relationship, a way of being with yourself in every moment, with tenderness, with patience, with truth. You are no longer afraid of your darkness because you've seen what lives there, your power, your creativity, your depth. The parts of you that were cast out, shamed, silenced, those are now your allies. They walk beside you, not behind you. You don't exile them anymore. You listen to them. You integrate them. You thank them. Because they led you here to the place where wholeness is no longer an idea, it's your experience. And this experience changes how you live. You speak less, but when you do it, carries weight. You rush less, but when you move, it's with purpose. You desire less, but when you love, it's with your entire being. You become intimate with the present, not out of discipline, but devotion. The world feels different, not because it changed, but because you have. You don't need constant stimulation. You don't need noise to fill the void. You don't need to be everything to everyone. You're content to be fully yourself, even if that means being misunderstood, even if that means being alone, because you're no longer lonely in solitude. You are accompanied by presence, by spirit, by the vastness within you that no one else can touch, yet everyone feels when they're near you. You've become magnetic, not because you're trying to be, but because truth always draws truth, and you live in truth now, not a perfect one, but a living one. A truth that breathes with you, breaks with you, evolves with you. A truth that makes you feel more alive in your rawness than you ever did in your performances. And now, the emptiness that once haunted you becomes holy. It becomes the temple where you meet yourself again and again. Not to become anything, but to remember that you already are. The emptiness is no longer scary. It's sacred. It's where you go when the world becomes too loud. It's where you return when you forget your center. It's where you listen, not to others, not to your ego, but to the silence that never lied to you. And in that silence, you hear it now, clearer than ever, the quiet voice of your soul, whispering, "You made it." Not to a finish line, but to a beginning. Not to perfection, but to presence. You are not healed in the way you thought you'd be. You're not glowing with unshakable certainty or floating above your humanity. You're still human, still messy, still tender. But now you're real. And that realness is the most sacred thing you've ever touched. Because it connects you not just to yourself, but to everything. To the trees, to the pain in someone else's eyes, to the ache in the collective soul of a world still asleep. You feel it all now, and instead of turning away, you stay. You open. You hold. And in that holding you realize this is the real awakening. Not the bliss, not the visions, not the mystical highs, but the ability to stay with what's true no matter how uncomfortable. The ability to love what's real, even when it's raw. The ability to carry your own darkness with dignity and still show up in the world as light, not because you escaped the shadows, but because you integrated them. You don't talk about awakening anymore. You live it. In the way you breathe, in the way you walk into a room, in the way you hold space for another without needing to fix them. In the way your presence itself becomes a balm for wounds that words could never reach. You've become the medicine you once searched for. Not because you studied it, but because you remembered it. Remembered what it means to be fully here, fully human, fully soul. So now when someone asks you about spiritual awakening, you don't give them answers. You don't offer doctrines or paths. You just listen. Because you know the most sacred thing you can offer is your presence. You know that truth isn't taught, it's caught. It's transmitted through energy, through silence, through the courage to be real in a world that tells you to pretend. And you found that courage not because you're fearless, but because you're tired of being anything but true. You walk the earth now with bare feet and a quiet heart. You speak less, but when you do, the words land in people like seeds. You live less from the mind and more from the mystery. You don't need to explain yourself anymore. You don't need to be understood, because you are known, not by others, but by the self. And in that knowing there is peace, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of embodiment, the kind that holds space for paradox, that lets grief and joy dance together, that makes room for the questions that have no answers, that sees life not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a poem to be felt. And you now are that poem, written in stardust and shadow, etched by suffering and silence, carved by the hand of life itself. You are not empty anymore. You are infinite, not because you escaped the pain, but because you let it shape you without closing your heart. And that perhaps is the final awakening, not to rise above the world, but to meet it more deeply, to fall so far into your own soul that you emerge not as someone new, but as someone true. And in that truth, you no longer chase the light. You become it.